11 de septiembre de 1973. Las Fuerzas Armadas y Carabineros de Chile declaran, primero, que el señor presidente de la República debe proceder a la inmediata entrega de su alto cargo a las Fuerzas Armadas y Carabineros de Chile. Segundo, que las Fuerzas Armadas y el Cuerpo de Carabineros de Chile están unidos para iniciar la histórica y responsable misión de luchar por la liberación de la patria del yugo marxista.
September 11th, 1973, a day that would go down in history as one of Chile's most infamous. In the early hours of the morning, the armed forces staged a coup that aimed to overthrow the elected government of Salvador Allende. Armed with a Kalashnikov gifted to him by Fidel Castro, a helmet that was handed out by General Sepulveda, Allende, along with his guards, would resist the first wave of assaults against the presidential palace. Even though there were thousands of militiamen ready to arm themselves in defense of the government, the higher-ups within the party, including Allende himself, realized that it was pointless. The civilians within La Moneda were asked to leave along with the rest of his staff. The carabineros that were part of the presidential guard were given permission to abandon their posts. Despite not having taken part in the shootout, they left behind their rifles and ammunition, so that those who remained would at least stand a fighting chance. General Sepulveda would attempt one last time to secure a ceasefire. However, after exiting the building to negotiate, he was detained. After several more hours of fighting and an intense bombardment by the Air Force, the defenders realized that all was lost and agreed to surrender. As the first soldiers entered the building, Allende would end his own life, as well as Chile's tradition of democracy. With the old government gone, a new one had to take its place. Around 7 p.m. in the Escuela Militar, the junta met up for the first time to discuss the future of the nation. There were 4 members in total, each one representing a branch of the armed forces. The first being the self-appointed director of the Carabineros, Cesar Mendoza, who that very same day had usurped his former boss, General Sepulveda. The second was Admiral José Toribio Merino of the Navy, arguably the mastermind of the coup, who had also usurped his former boss, Admiral Montero. The third was General Gustavo Ley, head of the Air Force. And lastly, the head of the army, General Agusto Pinochet Ugarte. Despite only having joined the plot to overthrow Allende a mere 2 days before the coup, Pinochet would go down, for better or for worse, as one of the most important figures in Chilean history.
¿Esto había sucedido en Chile antes? Nunca había sucedido esto.
Más de 60 años tengo, pero nunca vi cosas igual.
Muertos.
En el río, ¿cómo están? Yo los veo cuando los sacan. ¿No?
Los meten en unos tubos grandes que eso que hacen, sé que ahí los meten a los muertos, ellos mismos los carabineros.
Como caen de abajo y la gritadera ahí mismo, yo no puedo dormir con una guaguita que tengo, y esto ya estaría bueno. No hay alguien que saque la cara por esos guachos, tanto guacho que está quedando, tanto hijo sin
un sobrino de 10 niños.
En la cola el pan, por comprar pan.
Por contar comprando pan, lo mataron.
With Allende gone, the military was not only faced with the task of governance, but also with the question on what to do with their enemies. As you could expect, Allende's allies and ministers were removed. Letelier, Toa, and Almeida, to name a few, were detained and, for now, allowed to live. But not everyone was that lucky. Those who had stayed with the president during the coup found themselves being captured and beaten. Among them were the surviving members of Allende's bodyguard and 17 detectives, including their director, Eduardo Paredes, and a handful of civilians, such as Allende's personal doctor, Danilo Bartolin. Immediately after their surrender, they were taken to the Tacna regiment. 2 detectives who had surrendered earlier managed to negotiate the release of the others, but their boss, Eduardo Paredes, was still missing. He, along with 7 others, were taken to a military installation at Peldewe, never to be seen again alive. Unlike Paredes, the fate of Allende's bodyguards is mostly known, as they were amongst the 32 prisoners that were executed in the Tacna regiment between the 13th and the 14th of September. Aside from Allende's men, the military would also need a deal of their own. Sepulveda and Montero were kicked out of their respective branches by their own subordinates and were forced to retire. Carlos Prats, the ex-commander of the army who Pinochet at one point served loyally, went into exile into Argentina with his wife, Sofia. Before crossing the border, he asked a friend of his to give Pinochet a letter that he had wrote for him. The future will tell who was wrong. If what you guys have done brings general well-being to the country, and the people really feel like true justice has been imposed, then I am happy that I was wrong to try to find a political solution and prevent a coup. Not all were let off that easy. General Alberto Bachelet resigned from his post that very same day, but due to his relations with members of leftist groups, he was detained and later put under house arrest. Colonel Cantuarias, a friend of Pinochet's who had taken care of his family during the day of the coup, was arrested the next day for refusing to put down a workers' strike. After being held prisoner for 3 weeks, he was dead. Not even low-ranking conscripts were safe from internal purges. Michael Nash, a 19-year-old doing his military service, found himself in hot water with his commanding officer for refusing to shoot prisoners. He was executed, along with those who he refused to kill. For as many former soldiers and public officials that were victimized, it was the civilian population that had to deal with the worst. On the day of the coup, the students from the Universidad Técnica took shelter on their campus. But the very next day, the army had shown up guns blazing, so much so that they almost killed their own men with grenades. Everyone there were detained. Amongst them was the student leader Ociel Muñoz and the musician Victor Jara. They were but few who'd end up in the Estadio de Chile, one of the many concentration camps that had sprung up across the country. Not even foreigners were safe. During Allende's government, many refugees from other South American nations, such as Uruguay, sought shelter in Chile. Considering that most of these people were usually affiliated to leftist groups from back home, the new regime viewed them as a bad influence that had to be dealt with. Higher-profile prisoners such as Letelier and Almeida would be kept in Dawson Island, while everybody else ended up in places that were quickly improvised. Among those detained in the Estadio de Chile were some of the survivors from the Tacna regiment, including Danilo Bartolin. He would find himself locked up in the same cell as Ociel Muñoz and Victor Jara. They, and many others, would be subjected to almost daily beatings and abuse by their captors. But not all the soldiers were keen on causing pain and suffering towards the prisoners. The officer in charge of the foreigners in the Estadio Nacional, Major Lavanderos, disobeyed orders and released 54 Uruguayan prisoners who, just like many, took shelter in foreign embassies. In their case, it was the Swedish one. General Oscar Bonilla, one of the original plotters of the coup, would later secure the Uruguayan safe passage out of the country. While Bonilla was able to save them, he was too late to save Lavanderos. On October 18th, Lavanderos was confronted by a fellow officer, who took matters into his own hands, killing him on the spot. As time passed on, the prisoners in the two stadiums were either released or transported elsewhere. Núñez and Bartolin would survive their stay, but Victor Jara, who was recognized by one of the guards, was taken down to the basement. Apparently, one of the officers in charge loaded a single bullet into his revolver and played a game of Russian roulette until the gun fired, killing Victor Jara. According to the new authorities, they had been forced to act against Allende due to them uncovering a secret Marxist plan titled Plan Z, the goal of which was to eliminate top military generals. However, the evidence for this claim was rather lacking. To conduct this operation, the military said that Allende's men were stockpiling weapons, but only a few of these claimed stockpiles were uncovered, with the largest one being the leftovers from the presidential palace. While many members of the UP were certainly given training, and weapons did exist, what they could muster was rather pathetic. Our armament was reduced to 4 sticks of dynamite, more dangerous for us than for anyone else, a Mauser rifle from the Second World War, and 4 revolvers, including mine. We barely had any ammunition, and our adversaries were professional soldiers who were armed to the teeth. In the immediate aftermath of the coup, resistance put up by the former government was so small that the junta probably faced more resistance from their own troops. There is also the fact that General Ley himself would later admit that Plan Z was fabricated by Counter-Admiral Carvajal with the goal to help legitimize the coup. Regardless, it was still used as an excuse to quell any potential opposition. As you could probably expect, the syndicalist movement provided Allende's socialists with a large amount of support. Thus, they found themselves in the crosshairs of the military, with over 80% of their directors finding themselves either detained or dead, with many more going into hiding. Due to Allende's agrarian reform, many peasants were given land to work on and saw a rise in their standard of living. As a result, they were also sympathetic towards the socialists. The military and carabineros often entered the homes in the countryside in search of mythical stashes of weapons, and would also conduct many arrests. Unfortunately, it didn't end there, as there were many cases where civilians were murdered. On the 18th of September, a group of civilians, one of whose names was Blanca Valderas, were taken to a bridge crossing the Pilmaiquén River, forced onto their knees, and shot. But the gun that was supposed to be used against Valderas had jammed, and instead she was thrown in alive and shot at by the rest. She survived the execution and went into hiding. However, her husband, Joel Inostroza, was never seen again alive. Not even the church was safe from the military. Many priests and nuns were detained and interrogated merely for having provided help to those fleeing persecution. While it was rare for any of them to be killed, it did happen. Joan Alsina, who worked in the San Juan de Dios hospital, was arrested during the night of September 19th, and after being beaten by his captors, they took him to the bank of the Mapocho River and forced him to face away from them. "Face me when you kill me, so I can ask God for your forgiveness." He was shot, right after ushering out his final words. Only a day before his death, the junta had asked Cardinal Silva if they could break tradition and celebrate Dia de Them in the Escuela Militar instead of in a civilian church. Unfortunately for them, Silva wasn't going to accept their offer and made them celebrate it in the Church of National Gratitude. Amongst the attendees were some of the country's most influential people. Aside from the junta, several ex-presidents had also showed up, they being Gabriel González, Jorge Alessandri, and Eduardo Frei Montalva, who had to be convinced by Silva himself to attend. In just the first few days of the coup, the junta had made themselves several new enemies, mostly due to their violent and undemocratic activities. If you haven't noticed by now, the Catholic Church was one of them. While the Church never had the best relations with the socialists, they were very much against the overthrow of democratic institutions. A serious examination of the position taken by the archbishops identified that only 6 of them supported the dictatorship, while the other 24 kept centrist or progressive perspectives. With most of its members against the junta, Cardinal Silva managed to organize Chile's many different churches into a united front for the protection of human rights. First, forming the Pro-Peace Committee, and then the Committee for Cooperation for Peace in Chile, whose main objective was to aid the victims of the regime. The Christian Democrats, who were a large political party during the time, had initially stated that the armed forces felt obligated to step in and resolve Chile's political crisis. However, a group of them led by Bernardo Leighton had signed a document condemning the coup, and in time, that would be the position of the entire party. Former President Eduardo Frei Montalva also became one of Pinochet's most outspoken critics, and would do what he could to oppose him. As time went on, Patricio Aylwin would begin to play a very important role in Chile's fight for democracy. The survivors of the Socialist Party would, for obvious reasons, put up a bitter resistance against Pinochet from abroad, eventually coming back to Chile to confront him. Clodomiro Almeida would lead his own group of more radical socialists, separate from the rest of the party, but thanks to the efforts of some of its members, such as Geraldo Muñoz, the party would remain mostly united. Eventually, the Socialist Party would be led by Ricardo Lagos, who would become one of Pinochet's most notable opponents. What may be somewhat surprising to you all is that the US government also played a rather important role in opposing Pinochet. Despite Kissinger and Nixon both being rather passionate about their support in Chile's fight against communism, the US Congress was not so keen, viewing the regime as your typical dictatorship and would place sanctions against it. While most of the opposition were against the use of violence, the Communist Party and the MIR would distinguish themselves from the rest, as they put all methods on the table. The MIR would be very active at the start of the dictatorship, but would eventually fade into irrelevancy, with the Communist Party taking center stage. During their first meeting in the Escuela Militar, Merino, Ley, Mendoza, and Pinochet would discuss the future of Chile. Ley argued that he should preside over the junta first because he had been commander of his respective branch, but Pinochet argued against him, saying that the commander of the oldest branch, that being the army, should go first. After this organized discussion, Pinochet won and became president of the junta. However, it was agreed that he would eventually step down and give the presidency to another member. Congress was dissolved, the entire country was placed under martial law, and the junta appointed their own ministers to replace the old ones. By this time, they had full control of Chile. However, many believed that this would only be temporary. The Christian Democrats met with the junta on several occasions to discuss Chile's transition back to democracy. In one such meeting, Patricio Aylwin was told by Pinochet himself that the junta would remain in control for a period of 8 months to complete the transition. While Aylwin believed this to be too long, he didn't have much of a choice but to wait. Unfortunately for them, Pinochet's main goal was not to return Chile back into democracy, but to keep hold of power for as long as possible. To do so, he would need to secure his own position within the army first. Around the end of September that year, he eliminated the Committee of Evaluation for the Army, giving him increased power over his generals. He would also get rid of any potential rivals within the ranks. General Lutz, Director of Military Intelligence, was removed from his position and given a job as the junta's secretary. General Bonilla, who had been part of the coup longer than Pinochet, was given the harmless job of Minister of the Interior. In November, Pinochet founded the DINA, a secret police service that was responsible for persecuting Pinochet's enemies. To lead such a group, he appointed Colonel Manuel Contreras as its director. As you can guess, the moral standards of the DINA were rather low, with Contreras even saying, "I don't need saints here, I need prostitutes, thieves, and murderers." I wonder what the prostitutes are for. Aside from the many soldiers that joined, the DINA would open its arms to plenty of civilians of shady backgrounds, such as former members of the extremist group Fatherland and Liberty. Even foreigners would find work in the DINA. Many Cuban exiles, such as Virgilio Paz, would join to continue their fight against communism. The neo-fascist leader, Stefano del Chai, also found himself right at home with the likes of the DINA, and perhaps their most infamous agent, the American-born Michael Townley, would play a pivotal role in eliminating Pinochet's enemies. Society found itself under attack by the regime. Gone were the days of critical thinking. Now, it was up to the regime to decide the values of the country. To implement their doctrine of national security, a wide array of books were banned, ranging from communist theory to anything that talked negatively about authoritarianism. Perhaps the most effective way to reshape society's beliefs was through education. The military took charge of monitoring ideological and national security aspects within the educational system, demanding the denunciation of any comments on contingent politics, jokes referring to members of the governing board, and the distortion of concepts and patriotic values. Amongst the classes that were most affected was history, with its conflictive subjects such as the Industrial Revolution and the social structures of Latin America being censored. Universities were also targeted as the authorities tried to depoliticize them. The regime's control over education was so extensive that in 1980, Pinochet himself would even approve of the textbooks for 8th grade history and geography. Coming into 1974, Pinochet's grip on power and society would only increase. That same year, the gentleman's agreement to rotate the junta's presidency was dropped in favor of holding it until certain objectives were met. On June 14th, Pinochet passed Bill 527 that declared the junta as nothing more than a legislative branch, and that its president, Mr. Agusto Pinochet, would be given the title of Supreme Leader of the Nation. General Ley and many others believe this title to be absolutely ridiculous. Dear God. Who do you think you are? Since when? At the time, General Ley was probably the greatest threat towards Pinochet's power, but that did not last for long.
Mire, me costó porque hasta cierto, me daba una vergüenza verlo, si estaban hechos pedazos, si no eran cuerpos humanos, de manera que yo quería armarlos, por lo menos dejarlos en una forma decente, más o menos, pero de eso no se pudo. Se le sacaban los ojos con los, ¿cómo se llama? Con los corvos, les quebraban las mandíbulas y todo, les quebraban las piernas, al final le daban el golpe de gracia.
Unlike in other South American countries, the Catholic Church was against undemocratic policies and provided aid to the victims of the regime. Surprisingly, they even helped many socialists, despite the two groups not having the best history. I've been anti-clerical my whole life. You guys, the church, have been my worst enemy. In whose name have you come to save me? Just like in the early days following the coup, the church itself was continuously targeted. José Salaquet, one of the main lawyers of the Pro-Peace Committee, is detained and tortured by the authorities over the course of 2 months, until he is released and deported with around 160 other priests and nuns. Pinochet had personally demanded that Cardinal Silva dissolve the committee, which he finally did after the arrest of Salaquet. However, in its wake would come a new organization, this time a part of the church itself. Around the end of December 1975, the Vicarage of Solidarity is officially brought into existence, where it would continue the church's past work, potentially saving the lives of thousands. The junta was even pressured by the international community to release political prisoners, which resulted in Letelier and Almeida being freed from Dawson Island. But not all were given the same treatment, as many remained incarcerated and, in a few cases, ended up dying due to the abuse they had suffered or because they were simply executed. José Toa, who at one point was a close friend of Pinochet's, died in custody after falling ill and being continuously harassed. The official cause of his death was self-strangulation. Alberto Bachelet, who was locked up with another 79 former soldiers, also suffered a similar fate, as his health severely deteriorated due to constant torture, eventually resulting in a fatal heart attack. Prior to these last few cases, General Arellano Stark was given the order to travel around the country to supervise and speed up judicial processes regarding political prisoners. His first stop would be in the northern part of the country that was under the command of General Lagos and his 1st Division. On the 16th of October, his helicopter landed in the city of La Serena and had between 15 to 19 prisoners transported to the Arica Regiment, where they were all shot. That same day, another 13 prisoners were killed in the city of Copiapó. On the 17th, General Oscar Bonilla personally contacted General Lagos and insisted that the prisoners be defended accordingly, but there was very little both men could do, as another 14 were killed in Antofagasta the following day. The largest of the northern massacres would occur on the 19th in the city of Calama. Shortly after arriving, Arellano's men took 26 prisoners out of the city to a place called Tobater, where they were all shot and stabbed till dead. 2 years later, their bodies would be recovered and later disposed of in the Pacific Ocean. Immediately after the killings, General Lagos confronted Arellano as he had not given him permission to kill those people. However, Arellano didn't need his permission, because his mission was officially sanctioned by the commander of the army, General Agusto Pinochet. Lagos would later be removed from his post as commander of the 1st Division, and later forced to retire. General Arellano continued his journey around the whole country in what we now refer to as the Death Caravan. Unfortunately for him, Pinochet forced Arellano to retire once he was no longer useful. The DINA was also rather active in their pursuit of their enemies. While they predominantly killed and tortured within Chile's own borders, those abroad were not safe either. On September 30th, 1974, the DINA agent Michael Townley, with help from local Argentine collaborators, successfully planted a bomb under the car of ex-Chilean army commander Carlos Prats, killing both him and his wife in the DINA's first high-profile assassination attempt outside of Chile. Despite the DINA being a rather effective tool used by the regime, it was also disliked by a few generals, who particularly disliked its director, Colonel Manuel Contreras. Even though General Bonilla had essentially been demoted, he still took his job as Minister of the Interior quite seriously, even going as far as to visit impoverished communities. On one such visit, in May 1974, the locals informed him about the torture of prisoners that was occurring in the nearby Tejas Verdes regiment. Due to these rather horrific acts, Bonilla attempted to have Contreras arrested, but failed. In an encounter with both Pinochet and Contreras, Contreras insisted that the Marxists had infiltrated the government, hinting at Bonilla. As you can guess, this made General Bonilla quite mad. He was not alone in his dislike of Contreras. General Lutz also found himself in conflict with the colonel, as he was personally asked by a teacher that worked at the school that his daughter attended to look for her missing husband, who was probably taken by the secret police. During the investigation, Lutz ordered Contreras to provide him with information that he required. Since Contreras was just a colonel, he was obligated to follow orders, but refused to do so, saying that what he wanted was classified, which pissed off General Lutz. "Who do you think you are? How dare you talk like that to a general of the Republic? Wait and see just how this ends." In a meeting with Pinochet, both Lutz and Bonilla complained about Contreras and his DINA's insubordination. Instead of receiving its support, Pinochet simply said, "Gentlemen, I am the DINA," essentially telling them that the DINA had his blessing to do whatever the hell they wanted to. Now both Lutz and Bonilla were on his bad side. 6 months after the meeting with Pinochet, General Lutz suffered an internal hemorrhage and was taken to a civilian hospital and began to recover. However, he was then taken to a military hospital where he was placed under protection by the DINA. During his stay, Lutz's health began to deteriorate and his family was denied the privilege of visiting him. Eventually, Lutz's wife managed to see him and told him that the supreme leader of the nation was coming over for a visit. To that, Lutz simply said to her, "I beg you, don't let that man come and see me." On the 28th of November 1974, Lutz would die during surgery. 3 months after the passing of General Lutz, General Oscar Bonilla was involved in a fatal helicopter crash. The French company that manufactured the helicopter soon sent 2 of their employees to investigate the crash to verify what had happened with the aircraft. In a twisted fate of events, the 2 investigators would also die in a helicopter crash, only 18 days later.
The trauma which has shaken rural Chile affects even those who still have land. The regime balances the books. The peasants can't get credit. They fall into debt, and like this man, sell up in desperation to those with money from the cities. The strong destroy the weak.
Since the armed forces were better suited for fighting wars than they were at governing, they lacked a sophisticated plan for the country. Due to this, the military required civilians with proper education and experience to help administrate the new government. Since Chile was experiencing its worst economic crisis up to that point, civilian economists were quick to attempt to mentor the new regime with their own theories on how to fix the situation, often competing against each other for influence. Amongst them was a group of individuals who were considered by the rest to be radicals, but despite that, they would become the most influential of them all. Due to their place of study, they were known as the Chicago Boys. During the Cold War, the US government was keen on keeping other nations away from the Soviet bloc. One way to do so was to export their own ideology to other countries. Chile's Universidad Católica, which tended to represent the beliefs of conservatives and businessmen, wanted to revive free market values within the country, but lacked the ability to do so. With help from the Administration for International Cooperation, Católica was able to establish connections with the similarly like-minded University of Chicago. The initial deal that was signed in the 50s stated that 26 Chilean students from Católica would go on to the US to study in Chicago for a period of 3 years, eventually graduating in 1959. However, the deal was later modified, and the students were given an extra 2 and another 3 years to study, with several of them finishing in 1964. Other than the initial 26, dozens of other students would come afterwards. During their education, they were primarily subjected to the teachings of Milton Friedman. To summarize his beliefs, they consisted of minimal state intervention in the economy, the privatization of public services, and suspension of state subsidies. Upon returning to Chile, they took up work in fields such as education, business, and politics. During the elections of 1970, several Chicago boys tried to redact an economic plan based on their theories for the presidential candidate Jorge Alessandri. However, Alessandri's economic advisors deemed it to be too liberal, and it was rejected. Shortly after the coup, Admiral Merino hired the businessman Roberto Kelly to create an economic plan for Chile. Kelly, along with another businessman, Hernan Cubillos, would hire the Chicago boys named Sergio de Castro and Pablo Barahona, who would create the document that they called the Brick. All that was left for Admiral Merino was to convince the rest of the junta to accept the Chicago boys' proposition. Mendoza appears to have been the easiest to convince, as it doesn't seem that he put up too much resistance, but as for Pinochet and Ley, it was much harder. The Air Force under General Ley were against the reforms proposed by the Chicago boys, as they wanted to transform Chile into a welfare state, akin to how it used to be before Allende. The army under Pinochet had a long tradition of statism, as they wanted to secure important resources and industries that were vital to defense. Since Pinochet was head of the junta, Merino had to pressure him to agree to the reforms. After a little convincing by Milton Friedman himself about the benefits of the free market, Pinochet finally caved into Merino's demands. For the Chicago boys, this was a golden opportunity to try out their theories. On top of being given jobs as ministers, ideologically, they viewed the authoritarian style of governance as more practical. I have no doubts that, starting from 1973 and before, Chile is in need of an autocratic government, absolutely autocratic, that is to be capable of making reforms against the interests of any groups, no matter how important they are. On April 24, 1975, the Ministry of the Interior announces that they will be implementing shock therapy and that people will have to tighten their belts for what's to come. Between 1973 and 1979, government spending dropped by 40% of the GDP to only about 26, and the number of public workers decreased by 20% between 1974 and 1978. The agrarian reform that was conducted under Frei Montalva and Allende was also reversed. By 1979, about 30% of the expropriated surface had returned to its former owners. Although another 35% is assigned as individual property to 35,000 farmers, it is estimated that by the end of the decade, about half of these have already had to sell or rent their plots, as they do not have the essential support from the state to become small agricultural owners. The state's role as an active player in the economy was also drastically reduced, with 110 of its businesses being transferred to the private sector, especially the financial sector, with 86% of it being privatized. Interestingly, Codelco, Chile's state-owned mining company, remained under the control of the government despite the insistence of De Castro, as it provided the armed forces with most of its budget. By the end of 1975, the short-term effects of shock therapy had been a disaster for both the economy and society. GDP growth had dropped to minus 12.9% and minus 14.3% per capita. Local industry also suffered quite significantly, as they were unable to sustain themselves, and since there was an emphasis placed on the importation of goods, they were unable to compete with foreign businesses. Due to all of this, unemployment had skyrocketed up to between 14 and 17%, and the average income decreased. According to some sources, the results were far worse in the countryside. Since the agrarian reform was reversed, many farmers lost their homes, and by 1977, unemployment was allegedly at around 60%. Workers' rights were also severely deteriorated. The passing of Law No. 198 got rid of collective negotiation of worker unions and implemented in them only 3 directive positions that were meant to be held by senior company workers. Law No. 32 and 662 would make the process of dismissing social workers much easier. The final kick in the balls has got to be the fact that thousands were on the brink of starvation, only being saved by charity work from the church. The situation was so bad that up to 30,000 children in Santiago alone were reliant on soup kitchens to survive, and even then, they still suffered from malnourishment. While Chile's poor economic situation was quite dangerous, it would be the country's neighbors that would pose a serious threat to the nation's sovereignty. During his 17-year-long reign, Pinochet's government remained mostly politically isolated from the rest of the world, largely due to its authoritarian rule. Despite this, Pinochet was successful in aligning Chile with the anti-communist bloc, which just so happens to be made up of several other like-minded governments. In November 1975, Pinochet invited the directors of various foreign intelligence services from other South American countries to discuss a plan of cooperation between them to eliminate each other's political opponents. This plan would be titled Operation Condor, and despite contrary belief, it was not planned by the CIA. In fact, they only found out about it 2 months after, to which they would provide funding. There were 3 phases to this plan. Number 1, establish a center of cooperation in Chile. Number 2, initiate international operations in member states. Number 3, extend said operations outside of South America. On October 6, 1975, 2 Italian fascists who were affiliated with Del Che shot the Christian Democrat leader Bernardo Leighton and his wife Anita Frenzo in the city of Rome as they were returning to their home. The DINA agents Michael Townley, Virgilio Paz, and Del Che had been in Rome just a few days before. Surprisingly, both Leighton and Anita survived, but since Leighton had been shot in the head, his road to recovery took quite some time. After their failed attempt in Italy, the DINA considered to try their luck one more time and set their sights on Orlando Letelier. Michael Townley, Virgilio Paz, and several other DINA agents traveled to the US using fake passports with the objective of assassinating Letelier, which they would accomplish on September 1st. Interestingly, Henry Kissinger was aware of the plan and had demanded that the DINA not go through with it. The fact that Kissinger, out of all people, was unwilling to tolerate the assassination was a bad sign for things to come. As mentioned before, Nixon and Kissinger supported Pinochet quite intensely. The support went as far as to renegotiate Chile's debt and provide the country with economic aid. But US support was not unconditional. With Nixon out of the White House, Jimmy Carter's administration would not be nearly as friendly. Most likely to clear his image, Pinochet had 304 political prisoners released 3 days after Carter was elected, but this move would only go so far. Since having foreign agents illegally enter your country with forged documents to murder a man, the US began to pressure Pinochet to extradite Michael Townley so he could face trial. Initially hesitant, Pinochet ultimately caved into their demands and threw Michael Townley to the wolves the following year. Due to all the drama surrounding it, the DINA was disbanded and later replaced with the CNI, with General Olanier Mena as its director. In practice, this was nothing more than a name change. Contreras, now a general, would even continue to work within it behind the scenes. To make matters even worse, Chile's relations with its neighbors, some of which were members of Operation Condor, began to threaten the country's sovereignty. In the 1970s, Chile was facing what we called the Free Front Hypothesis. In short, we had problems with Peru, with Bolivia, and with Argentina. The army was deployed along the whole border, with full readiness and absolutely prepared to face a war that, at the time, seemed inevitable. During this period, Peru was in line with the Soviet bloc, and when you consider their history, they were natural enemies towards Chile. After Pinochet's coup, many prominent socialist leaders, including Fidel Castro, viewed this as a defeat that favored the spread of fascism, and were keen on stopping it, even if it meant war. Between 1974 and 1975, the Chilean army was camped out along the Peruvian border, preparing for an attack, even going as far as to mine the shit out of every potential crossing. If the Peruvians decided to attack, the defenders would have to face between 300 and 400 Soviet-built tanks, a force that probably outmatched their own. Luckily, this war never happened. The Peruvian dictator, General Valesco, was stopped by his own people and replaced by another general before he could begin his invasion. However, this didn't entirely end the situation. In September 1976, the Chilean Navy detected what appeared to be a Peruvian submarine off the coast of Viña del Mar and proceeded to launch depth charges at it. To this day, the event continues to be surrounded in mystery. That same year, Bolivia started complaining about being landlocked. Pinochet met with the Bolivian dictator Hugo Banzer in an event known as the Hug of Charania to discuss a solution for Bolivia's lack of maritime access. However, both Peru and Argentina proposed that an area in northern Chile be administrated by 3 different nations. As you could probably guess, Chile was very much against this. Now you may be asking, why is Argentina involved in all of this? Well, that is because they also had a border dispute with Chile regarding the Beagle Channel and its islands, specifically Picton, Linux, and Nueva. Even though both nations had signed a treaty stating that the islands belonged to Chile, the new Argentine dictator, General Rafael Videla, believed that a quick war would help him gain support and began to demand that the islands be handed over. In response to the threats, thousands of Chilean soldiers were deployed along the entire border, mostly in the south to defend against an Argentine offensive, and in the north to launch their own counterattack in response to an invasion. To assist in the defense of the country, both private and state-owned businesses were obligated to provide their resources in case of an invasion. The civilian population was also mobilized to assist in the preparation of the war effort. Even as war seemed imminent, the population remained calm. In Pinochet's entire career as president, this is perhaps the only time the country was united under a single goal. Even members of the opposition, such as Frey and Almeida, came out in support of Chile's defense. But this is where the good things end. Chile was still faced with a difficult situation, as supplies and spare parts for the armed forces were hard to come by, especially in the case of the Air Force, who, on top of that, was dealing with some internal drama between Ley and Pinochet. As mentioned before, Chile's international image had been tarnished due to human rights violations and had an arms embargo called the Kennedy Amendment placed on them, preventing the military from getting everything they needed. On December 22, 1978, Argentina was supposed to launch what they called Operación Soberania, the planned invasion of Chile. Luckily for the Chileans, they were aware of this and had their soldiers on high alert, waiting all night in their trenches to face what was probably the most powerful military on the continent. At that moment, it seemed that war was inevitable, yet it never happened. After waiting all night, some soldiers felt relieved, some were still under stress, while others had broken down into tears. With further mediation from Pope Juan Pablo II, Argentina and Chile signed the Act of Montevideo in January 1979, significantly reducing the threat of war. All things considered, Pinochet handled the situation as best as he could, except for one thing that I'll get to soon. While he may have saved Chile for the near future, it would not be the last time the two countries would face off in a war that seemed inevitable. In 1977, Pinochet claimed in a speech that Chile needed a new democracy, one that was authoritarian, protected, technical, and integrative. He announced that in 1980, Chile would begin a 5-year process to transform itself into this new democracy. However, the junta didn't back this plan, especially General Ley, who, by this time, was probably Pinochet's biggest rival. Pinochet would mostly abandon these plans in favor of a referendum announced in December that year on whether they supported the regime or not. Initially, Merino was opposed to it, but would change his opinion. As for General Ley, he wanted Chile to return to a more traditional style of democracy, more akin to how it had been before Allende. Thus, he was against Pinochet's plan. Regardless, it happened on January 4th, 1978, under conditions of martial law and without electoral registry and observers. Obviously, Pinochet won. Even though there wasn't much Ley could do about it, he was still against Pinochet's plan, and even went as far as to declare so in an Italian newspaper. By now, Pinochet's power had grown to the point that he no longer needed to tolerate Ley anymore, and would soon deal with him. On June 24th, 1978, soldiers belonging to the army surrounded the Ministry of Defense and the junta's headquarters, as well as Chile's Air Force bases. When he showed up for work that day, he found himself being kicked out of the government. After a fierce discussion with Pinochet, Ley and most of his senior generals were forced to resign, as well as a few others who did so in solidarity. What's interesting is that Lay's replacement was General Maffei, who was a close friend of the now deceased General Bachelet, and who also had a different vision for Chile's future. Maybe there just wasn't anyone else to take his place. Regardless, he wasn't much of a threat towards Pinochet. Keep in mind that all of this was going on at the same time as the Beagle conflict. To purge the Air Force of its senior generals, and perhaps have to face armed resistance from them, was not a smart decision for the time. However, it all ended with very little consequences. With the last of his troublesome generals out of the way, the only thing that really posed a threat to Pinochet, aside from Argentina, were the hundreds of guerrillas belonging to the MIR that were now on the offensive. Starting in 1978, the MIR launched Operación Retorno, which was meant to establish groups of insurgents in the countryside, but had been a failure. It wouldn't, however, stop them from trying to depose Pinochet. To start off the 1980s, the MRI launched a series of attacks on police stations all over the country. They even stole the flag that Chile's independence was sworn over, but their most notable accomplishment was the assassination of Lieutenant Colonel Roger Vergara, director of the Military School of Intelligence. In response to all this, the CNI would try to retaliate, but weren't that successful. One of their agents, who had infiltrated the organization, Carlos Tapia, was later caught and executed in the middle of the street by the MIR. Even though they would remain active during all of Pinochet's regime, the MIR was unable to significantly change anything. In August 1980, Pinochet announced a constitutional referendum that was to take place only a month later, giving voters the choice to choose between yes, in favor, or no, against a new constitution. Due to the suddenness of the referendum, the opposition had very little time to organize, and to add to their difficulties, they were censored and arrested if they tried to protest. There was one exception to this though, as they were given one chance to express their feelings in the Caupolicán theater. Several members of the opposition went to give speeches, with the most famous of them being that of ex-president Eduardo Frei Montalva. The nation has already decided, before anyone said, that they were voting no, although they know that they will have no means of true control over the scrutiny. That's why no one has any illusions about the results. But this no will be categorical. No to the plebiscite itself and everything it means. It will be a testimony before our own conscience and before our own country. For his words against the regime, Eduardo Frei Montalva would die during surgery on January 22nd, 1988. One of the doctors that had treated him was a member of the secret police, while another had previously operated on the deceased General Lutz, leaving very little impression that this could have been an accident. Unsurprisingly, the new constitution was approved, with 67% of the votes in favor. There were also some irregularities with the plebiscite. The only reliable proof that someone voted, and that it was verifiable, is that one end of the root card was cut off with scissors. In some cases, the military cut off the end of the cards and returned people to their homes without entering the premises to carry out the act of voting. Afterwards, the majority of the votes came out of those ballot boxes for yes in favor of the new constitution. According to some sources, there were even more votes than people in some cities, and according to an ex-CNI agent, members of the secret police were instructed to vote several times, which would explain a lot. Besides, just like in the last plebiscite, there was no electoral registry, no transparency, no meaningful opposition, and it was done under conditions of martial law. Regardless, the constitution was approved and was written by a few selected officials with close to no input from the populace. The result was a constitution that was rather undemocratic. To name a few details, it established a strongly presidential model, a national security council of mostly military personnel. The armed forces were also considered guarantors of the institutionality, with commanders immovable from their positions, a binominal electoral system favoring the existence of only two large political conglomerates. A Senate composed in part of appointed senators, and local governments presided over by appointed mayors, and severe restrictions on the possibility of constitutional reform. To celebrate his victory, Pinochet gave himself the title of President of the Republic and the rank of Captain General, which had only been held previously by Bernardo O'Higgins. He also moved his office into La Moneda, away from the rest of the junta, and the cherry on top of all this was the fragmentation of the Socialist Party into several smaller groups. After the coup, the Socialists went into exile in places such as East Germany. Despite all wanting revenge against a common enemy, the party broke apart into several smaller groups over the discussion on what they did wrong. The two main groups were the reformists, led by Carlos Altamirano, and the other, that I'm going to call the hardliners, were led by Clodomiro Almeida. There was also a neutral group that called themselves the Swiss, in which both Ricardo Lagos and Geraldo Muñoz were part of, that wanted to reunite the party. But until that happened, Pinochet was able to sleep easy at night, just for a little bit longer.
Hubo una guerra irregular que fue muy bien planeada por la KGB.
¿Pero qué le parece que se hayan encontrado en una sola tumba 2 cadáveres enterrados?
Pero qué economía más grande.
Despite the benefits brought to him by the Chicago model, Pinochet never fully committed to it. That way, if it completely failed, he would be able to ditch it. Not even in the most prosperous years did I have the idea that the model was a road with no return. There always existed the sensation that all of a sudden, they could convince him, Pinochet, of antagonistic measures. By 1981, the Chilean economy began to recover from the 70s, with the GDP growing by 6.5% that year. But even during this supposed miracle, there were still many issues that persisted after shock therapy. Despite the market being quite free, investment was still low, at around 15% of the GDP, which was lower than it had been in the 60s. Wages were also significantly lower, having fallen by 16% from the following decade. The peso also had an artificially low exchange rate of 39-1 on the dollar. As a result, 50% of loans were given in dollars. The price of Chilean exports had dropped at the same time international interest rates increased, and the dollar became more expensive. There was also a huge deficit in the current account of balance of payments of that consisted of 15% of the GDP by the end of 1981. Many local businesses had fallen in debt with foreign and international banks, thus were filled with petrodollars. While inflation was drastically reduced, it was still a major concern, as Sergio de Castro called for a reduction in salaries to combat it. However, this was refused. Since everyone was going into debt, the state had to nationalize 4 private banks and several other financial entities to prevent them from going bankrupt, and would also guarantee any savings deposited in them, a move that would cost them $300 million in just 2 months. In an attempt to resolve the situation, Pinochet forces Sergio de Castro to resign from his post as Minister of Finance and replaces him with the more pragmatic Hernan Bucci. But this accomplishes very little. The final blow to the Chilean economy was the oil glut of the 1980s, which was the equivalent to a kick in the balls that would have the country on its knees for the next decade. To accompany the minus 11% drop in GDP, the already suffering national industry lost another 810 businesses that went bankrupt, and along with it, 20% of Chile's production decreased. The situation was so bad that the state had to nationalize around 80% of the country's financial institutions to prevent them from breaking. Unsurprisingly, the already impoverished population was hit hard, with unemployment reaching 28% and later 31% in 1982 and 1983 respectively. You may as well consider it to be even higher, as over 200,000 Chileans were working low-income jobs that were given to them by the state that only paid around a third of minimum wage. To add insult to injury, in a speech, General Shit-for-Brains declared that Chile was a long-term enemy. In response to such a statement, the Chilean armed forces were once again forced to mobilize and man their trenches in preparation for war. Luckily, they weren't alone, as the British were quite mad that Argentina had screwed with their rock collection. After Margaret Thatcher sent a force to reclaim the islands, the Argentines were eventually defeated with a little help from the Chileans. While the British would later exaggerate Chile's contributions to the war effort, they did help enough, so much so that Margaret Thatcher would consider Pinochet to be a friend. With the collapse of the Argentine junta, Chile was no longer at risk of war and could focus on more important matters, such as eliminating Pinochet's enemies. After the MIR had successfully assassinated General Carol Urzúa, the militants that had taken part in the event were later hunted down by the CNI and killed in the streets. This was perhaps the last meaningful victory that Pinochet would achieve, as the MIR would become less relevant after the death of some of their leaders, but from here on out, Pinochet's regime would slowly begin to fall apart as the population grew tired and the opposition became organized. Even though the Socialist Party was still fragmented, the Swiss and the Reformists managed to form an alliance with perhaps the most important political party in Chilean history, that being the Christian Democratic Party that at the time was under the leadership of Gabriel Valdés. After being outlawed in 1977, the Christian Democrats were very much against the regime. Despite having been fierce opponents, both they and the socialists were now under a common cause after re-evaluating their beliefs. Patricio Alvin had gone from saying that he preferred a military dictatorship over a Marxist one to now fighting beside the socialists against said military dictatorship, while Ricardo Lagos, who was now distancing himself from the radical left and took a less violent way to fight against Pinochet. These two political conglomerates, along with the Radical Party and a handful of Republicans, would sign the Democratic Manifesto in March 1983. Interestingly, the Communist Party did not play a major role in this alliance, largely due to their insistence on defeating Pinochet by all means necessary, which included armed resistance. Since the rest of the opposition didn't want to give Pinochet a chance to label them as terrorists, they kept away from the communists, only ever interacting with a few of their representatives here and there. By September of that year, the socialists managed to reunite most of their party, except for a small group of hardliners led by Almeida. Regardless, that didn't stop the opposition in screwing over Pinochet. One of their first moves was to get in contact with Rodolfo Siegel, leader of Chile's largest workers' union, to plan a day of national protest. While they certainly had the numbers to take to the streets, it didn't change the fact that it was still very dangerous. The previous year, in February, the syndicalist leader, Dogabel Jimenez, was shot and stabbed several times by CNI agents till dead for trying to organize a strike. His murder was then blamed on Juan Alegria, an innocent man who, after being beaten by the same men who murdered Jimenez, was forced to sign a confession. After that, they cut his wrist and let him bleed to death. The Democratic Alliance decided at the time was to act on May 11, 1983. After handing out leaflets on the streets, they could only hope that the word had gotten out to enough people for the event. On the day of the protest, kids stayed home from school and everyone left work early. At 8 p.m., the time of the protest, people from all over the country began banging pots and pans from their homes, honking the horns of their cars, and eventually taking to the streets. That night, the capital Santiago came to life, with the sounds of tens of thousands of angry citizens, and, with the help of Siegel, thousands of miners went on strike in support. The authorities were completely overwhelmed and were unable to stop the protest, no matter how violent the response was. Aside from a few casualties and the closure of some radio stations, the protest was a massive success. To follow up their previous one, another protest was planned for June 14th, with similar results. However, the one that occurred on the 11th of July was faced by much stronger resistance, as Pinochet had sent the army out to the streets. On that day alone, 24 people were killed. Aside from the rising death toll, the protest pressured Pinochet enough that they brought him to the negotiation table. While the Democratic Alliance did not receive all their demands, some progress was made. A large amount of Chilean exiles were allowed to return home, the curfew was removed, and the state was forced to tolerate the existence of opposition parties and media that was critical towards them. There would also be another set of talks in September, where the possibility of parliamentary elections were discussed. Unfortunately for Pinochet, the opposition was not satisfied and continued to organize manifestations. At one such event on September 8th, a manifestation that was attended by both Geraldo Muñoz and Gabriel Valdez turned into a violent brawl as the carabineros forced the protesters to disperse, in which Valdez was even tear-gassed. Afterwards, there was another set of talks between the government and the opposition. This time, it was about possible modifications to the constitution. In fact, General Mathey himself was in favor of shortening the constitution's itinerary, much to the disapproval of Pinochet. To better organize themselves, the Democratic Alliance would set up their own executive committee with a presidency that would rotate between the leaders of the opposition, starting with Gabriel Valdez, later with Ricardo Lagos and Enrique Silva. For the next few years, the main strategy of the opposition was to continue the protest, to pressure the government into giving them more concessions. As for Pinochet, he grew rather tired of having to negotiate with his opponents, and, while he was unable to stop them, started resorting to more violent measures. Shortly after the talks ended, 900 people were arrested, 150 were injured, and another 10 were killed. The carabineros also began arresting people en masse from poorer neighborhoods, and, at times, indiscriminately firing their weapons at civilians. In one such case, in the Población de la Victoria, the carabineros had such a disregard for human life that a stray bullet killed a priest named André Harlan, who was inside of his local church reading the Bible. On top of this, the continued resistance of the church was further punished when several foreign priests, such as Dennis O'Hara, were arrested and later deported. Even though Cardinal Silva had been replaced by Juan Francisco Fresno, the Vicarage of Solidarity continued to shelter Pinochet's enemies and document his crimes. The newspaper, Solidaridad, continued to denounce human rights violations on a monthly basis. Even though he was trying his hardest to stay in power, Pinochet's grip of the country was growing weaker after every protest. After years of poverty and oppression, the populace wasn't just fed up with the regime, but was also struggling to simply survive. In the eyes of many, Pinochet needed to go, and the lengths that they were willing to take for justice was in some cases so desperate that on one such occasion, a man by the name of Sebastián Acevedo lit himself on fire to protest the arrest of his children, later dying of his wounds. But most surprisingly of all was that not even the Chilean courts were willing to tolerate his offenses. After an investigation conducted by Judge Jose Canovas found that 14 carabineros were guilty of the murder of 3 members of the Communist Party, the public backlash the regime received was massive. In response, Cesar Mendoza, director of the Carabineros and member of the junta, was ordered to resign by Pinochet as he needed a scapegoat for the public's anger, with Mendoza soon being replaced by General Rodolfo Stange. On August 25th, 1985, with mediation from the church, the Democratic Alliance of the government, along with some minor political factions, signed the National Accord for the Transition to Democracy, which was meant to give legitimacy to Chile's democratic transition. Considering that this had the support of most of the junta, Pinochet was rather pissed and refused to sign it. Because of Pinochet's refusal to sign the National Accord, a new group appeared called the Assembly of Civility that called for more protests against the regime. During one such protest, on the 2nd of July, 1986, Rodrigo Rojas and Carmen Gloria were covering the manifestation as journalists when they were detained by a group of soldiers who proceeded to cover them in gasoline and set them on fire. Miraculously, both initially survived, though Rojas eventually died of his wounds. While Pinochet responded with violence to those who opposed them, it would soon be their turn to strike back. In 1983, the Communist Party established their armed wing, called the FPMR, whose main goal was to destabilize the regime through armed struggle. After a few years, they would finally get their chance to strike at Pinochet himself. The FPMR had established contacts with the Cuban government, who supplied them with weapons. During their largest shipment, that included assault rifles and rocket launchers, it was detected by the CIA, who later informed the Chilean army. Despite losing most of it, the FPMR had retained what was necessary to conduct their most ambitious operation yet, Operation 20th Century. 24 militants, led by Jose Valenzuela Levy, went on what they believed to be a suicide mission with the objective of assassinating Agusto Pinochet. The plan was to ambush Pinochet's escort as he was traveling through Cajón del Maipo on his way back to Santiago after the weekend. The final date of the attack was scheduled for Sunday, September 7th, 1986. While the preparation for the ambush was a success, the militants lacked proper training and barely knew how to use their weapons. Regardless, they would try. The convoy was made up of 2 motorcycles and 5 other cars, with a total of 26 bodyguards from the Carabineros, CNI, and Army Special Forces. Despite their training, the soldiers were caught off guard by the militants, who were shooting at them from elevated positions. The ambush turned into a massacre. Out of 26 guards, 12 were injured, and 5 were killed. I'm sure most of you have noticed the absence of the man they were supposed to kill. So what happened to Pinochet? Shortly after the shooting started, Pinochet's Mercedes turned around and headed back into the mountains. During their escape, one of the attackers by the name of Marcos got so close to Pinochet that the warhead launched from his M72 Law didn't have time to arm and bounced off of the car door. Pinochet had escaped with his life, and he wasn't the only one, as all of his attackers had escaped, with only one of them suffering a slight injury. Once he was back in La Moneda, Pinochet declared to the press, "This is a war with all its letters. This is a war with no limits and no quarrel." In retaliation to the attempt on Pinochet's life, the CNI wrote a hit list with the names of several members of the opposition. In their hunt, they were successful in eliminating 4 members of various leftist groups, with their bodies being found shortly after. However, their fifth target, Luis Toro, managed to escape after his neighbors scared off the police. Around the same time, a contingent of civil policemen arrived at the house of opposition leader Ricardo Lagos. Shocked that they entered his house in the middle of the night, Lagos demanded an explanation, to which the policemen simply said, "Don't worry, you have to come with us. You're lucky we got here first." Shortly after their departure, another group of officers arrived at the house. This time, they were from the CNI, and were asking if Lagos had already been taken. Apparently, the civil police officer who ordered Lagos' arrest was a former student of his, and when he saw the list of people that were supposed to be detained, he recognized Lagos' name and sent his own men to get to him first, potentially saving his life. They had also gone to the house of Jose Carrasco, but they were too late. Both his wife Lisa and friend Muñoz did everything they could to get Lagos out of jail and prevent him from being deported. Aside from negotiating with the authorities, they also asked for help from several foreign diplomats, and even got former US President Jimmy Carter to demand for Lagos to be released. Eventually, he was set free. Lagos, just like Pinochet, had escaped with his life, and he wasn't too happy about the whole incident.
Le voy a recordar, General Pinochet, que usted el día del plebiscito de 1980 dijo: Presidente Pinochet no sería candidato en 1989. La cámara está enfocando, espero. Y ahora le promete al país otros 8 años, con tortura, con asesinatos, con violación de derechos humanos. Me parece inadmisible que un chileno tenga tanta ambición de poder, de pretender estar 25 años en el poder.
Ricardo,
Chileno algunos nunca ha estado así.
Ricardo, aquí los que
usted
están
va a tener
convocados
que
son
responder,
ustedes.
y usted va a tener que responder entre el sí o el no.
Ricardo, lo
y
que
yo
el
lo
país quiere
emplazaría
saber...
a que hiciera... Raquel, usted me va a excusar.
No, es que
Hablo
estamos
por
preguntándole
15 años
nosotros
de
a ustedes.
silencio y me parece indispensable que el país sepa que tiene una encrucijada y una posibilidad de salir de esa encrucijada, civilizadamente, a través del triunfo del no.
In Pinochet's constitution, it was written in 1988 that there would be a plebiscite where people could vote in favor or against a candidate appointed by the junta. Once again, people would be given the choice between yes and no. Despite saying he wouldn't, Pinochet decided to run for president for another 8-year-long term. But if he wanted to succeed, he'd have to regain the support of a population that was growing increasingly tired of his administration. If there is something that you should know about your average Chilean from the 1980s, is that they were both extremely poor and quite religious, something that is relatively easy to exploit. Since they needed better housing, Pinochet decided to order the construction of affordable housing units to improve the standard of living, thus giving him more support. If you have noticed by now, during these times the church played quite an important role in Chilean society and politics, so when Pope Juan Pablo II visited the country in 1987, Pinochet took full advantage of it. When the Pope was touring the presidential palace, Pinochet broke protocol to have both him and the Pope seen on the balcony with each other. While this was great and all for Pinochet, it didn't change the fact that the country hadn't fully recovered from its worst economic crisis in history. With Hernan Bucci as Minister of Finance, several changes were made to the Chicago model. By 1985, many state-owned businesses were privatized or, in some cases, reprivatized. The central bank also began to regulate the exchange rates instead of the markets. Protectionist policies were even implemented in certain areas of the economy to help favor local industry instead of relying on imports. By 1988, annual growth was at 7.3%, and inflation was at around 14%. Regardless of all that, the results were rather mediocre, as they were mostly just recovering from what had been lost. On top of that, poverty remained a serious issue. Aside from Pinochet, the opposition were also making their own preparations for the referendum. After the attempt on Pinochet's life, the Socialists and Christian Democrats tried to persuade the Cubans to stop supplying weapons to the FPMR, but since Castro's regime preferred using violence to pursue their goals, they refused. Despite the support they were receiving from the Cubans, the FPMR had suffered a major blow shortly after the failed assassination. Many of their members had to flee the country to places like Vietnam, Cuba, and the Soviet Union, while others went into hiding. The CNI organized Operation Albania, a staged confrontation between them and members of the FPMR. Several militants, including José Valenzuela, were murdered shortly after being arrested. In time, others were also killed. The FPMR also separated into two different groups, the first being loyal to the Communist Party, and the last being autonomous, led by Raúl Pellegrin. The Communist Party was left with very little firepower, and their influence diminished. After years of protests and negotiations, the opposition realized that the best way to defeat Pinochet was to beat him at his own game. To do so, the opposition parties would have to register as legal entities. The Christian Democrats and the Radicals were the first, but the Socialists were unable to do so, as Marxist parties were banned by the Constitution. As a solution, they created the Party for Democracy, with Ricardo Lagos as its president. Eventually, the Democratic Alliance fell apart shortly after the Socialists left the organization, but with help from Clodomiro Almeida, the opposition was reorganized into the National Command for No. Their flag was a rather colorful one, having a rainbow on it to represent the diverse set of opinions held by its members. The one opinion that they all shared, and probably the most important one, was that Pinochet needed to go. By 1988, the year of the referendum, the regime's power had severely weakened. Pressure from both the opposition and the international community forced Pinochet to grant more civil liberties to his opponents. But he still had one advantage. For the past 15 years, the entire population was subjugated to propaganda. What little economic achievements the regime had achieved were used to convince people that one day they will eventually benefit from them. The propaganda machine's greatest success was probably covering up Pinochet's crimes. Many people who had disappeared were believed to be in exile, while those whose bodies were uncovered were blamed on left-wing extremist groups. As an example of this, a woman by the name of Marta Negra was arrested on the 9th of December in 1974. Despite being tortured and later killed in prison, a state newspaper wrote her name on a list as one of 119 people killed out of the country as part of some sort of leftist infighting. Even though the opposition only had 15 minutes of screen time every day, they made the most of it. While Pinochet made the decision between yes and no, as one between chaos and stability, the opposition got more creative. In their promotional videos, people of all different ages and social classes were coming together to vote for a better future. No hate, no violence, no fear. Vote no. Against all odds, 92% of all Chileans who were eligible to vote came out onto the streets to exercise their rights. The lines were endless, but nobody left. People even came from hospitals to vote. People with severe disabilities, the elderly, and many, many young adults. This time around, there was proper electoral registration and around 20,000 observers to prevent fraud. After voting himself, Pinochet met with the press and said that there were 25,000 soldiers ready to take action, only if necessary. 3 days earlier, the Carabineros informed Alwin and Lagos that several of their buses had been stolen. Lagos sent a letter to General Maffei, who then replied by saying that he wouldn't support any interference with the plebiscite. Alvin and Lagos soon met with General Stange, who ordered that all remaining buses would have new numbers painted on their roofs, and would shoot at anyone who didn't have them. The missing buses finally showed up the day of the plebiscite, driving around Santiago with CNI agents inside. In one such instance, they even traded fire with the Carabineros, but it was ultimately a futile effort. Inside a bunker built under La Moneda, Pinochet met with Merino, Stange, and Maffei. According to Maffei, Pinochet urged the rest of the junta to sign a decree that would give him extra powers in case he lost the referendum. The three of them refused, saying that they had to respect the Constitution. General Santiago Sinclair said that the army was ready to take action, but Pinochet simply said that the Constitution must be respected, Sir Vice Commander-in-Chief. Alvin, Lagos, and Muñoz were with each other the night of the plebiscite, patiently waiting for the results. When over 7.2 million votes were counted, they announced the final results. 43% in favor, and 54.7% against. Pinochet ran alone and came in last.
Reconozco y acepto el veredicto mayoritario expresado en el día de ayer por la ciudadanía. Respetaré y haré respetar este resultado en consonancia con mi norma de conducta invariable como jefe del Estado.
Even though Pinochet lost the referendum, the violence didn't stop. Many people who were out in the streets celebrating his defeat found themselves being targeted by the carabineros and were forced to disperse. Despite the FPMR having been weakened, they still had the strength for one last major operation. On October 21st, they began what they called a national patriotic war by seizing 4 towns throughout the country. They had hoped for the rural population to rise in support of the rebellion, but by this time, people were just tired of all the fighting. In the town of Los Guiñes, Corporal Juvenal Vargas was killed. The FPMR would also suffer casualties. Raúl Pellegrin and Cecilia Magni, 2 of the faction's main leaders, were arrested, tortured, and then killed. In May 1989, the junta had accepted a series of reforms proposed by the opposition that were later approved by another plebiscite in June that year. The president would now serve 4 years instead of 8. The number of elected senators was increased. Article 8, which basically banned anything the government deems offensive, was abolished, and the president's power was reduced. Chile's first presidential elections were scheduled for December that year. The Christian Democrats, Radicals, Socialists, PPD, and many smaller groups banded together and formed a coalition known as the Concertation of Parties for Democracy. All they needed now was a candidate. While Ricardo Lagos was probably the most popular, the alliance wanted a centrist to avoid infighting. The decision was made that Patricio Alvin, the coordinator for the No campaign and president of the Christian Democrats, would be nominated as their candidate. The Chilean right also wanted to partake in the elections and needed their own candidate, with a few of them even recommending that Pinochet should run for president. However, this was an opinion held by the minority, and most wanted a civilian. After a lot of convincing, they eventually got Pinochet's former Minister of Finance, Hernan Bucci, to run for them. After the voters had left the booths, the final vote was counted. The businessman Francisco Javier Errázuriz got 15.4%, Bucci had 29.4%, and Alvin with 55.2% of the vote, winning the election. On March 11th, 1990, Pinochet finally gave up the presidential band, handing it over to Gabriel Valdés, who then gave it to Alvin. After 17 years, Pinochet's dictatorship finally came to an end.
Es hermosa y múltiple la tarea que tenemos por delante. Restablecer un clima de respeto y de confianza en la convivencia entre los chilenos, cualesquiera que sean sus creencias, ideas, actividades o condición social, sean civiles o militares. Sí, señores, sí, compatriotas, civiles o militares, Chile es uno solo.
Unlike other dictators, Pinochet has probably enjoyed a much better reputation than most, and, on the surface, it's easy to see why. But when you start to dig a little deeper into what actually happened during his regime, you start to see a much more grimmer picture. Whenever you bring up his name, it's impossible to avoid a large array of comments celebrating his economic achievements, but arguably, Pinochet's management of the economy was his greatest failure. Throughout his entire regime, the economy was either collapsing or struggling to recover from said collapse, with annual GDP growth averaging only 3.4%, not to mention the even lower per capita growth of 1.9%. While the inflation rate was drastically lowered after the fall of Allende, it remained rather high, averaging around 86%. The instability and poor decisions he made not only scared away any possible investors, but also resulted in decades of industrialization being destroyed in a matter of a few years, weakening the national economy. As a result of all the economic mismanagement, the average Chilean saw such a decrease in their standard of living that they were poorer than they had been in the 60s, with unemployment being the worst it has ever been in the country's history. Even if they managed to obtain a job, the amount of money that they were making had dropped by 16% from the 1970s. Your average Chilean was so down bad that a little under 40% of the entire population was living under the poverty line, and wealth inequality had gone so bad that it continues to cause problems to this day. When people were asked why they voted against Pinochet, 72% said that it was due to poverty, unemployment, or them just not liking his economic policies. Had Pinochet actually improved the economy, he most likely would have stayed in power for just a little bit longer. But that didn't happen. He literally gave people no other option but to vote him out. After all, what other choice did they even have? Wait another 8 years? Maybe even 16? And for what? Vague promises that perhaps one day they could get some scraps? The only reason why the myth of the Chilean miracle exists was because a small political and economic minority benefited from the regime and kept on insisting that their experience was enjoyed by most, or perhaps because they believed that the alternative was communism. Since the signing of the Declaration of Independence, that was then later destroyed the day of Pinochet's coup, Chile had been getting progressively more democratic over the course of its history. By 1973, the country as a whole enjoyed more freedom than they ever had, and became increasingly active in politics. To have 155 years of progress be destroyed in a single day, followed by 17 years of brutality that they've never seen, was a deeply traumatic event for Chilean society. During Pinochet's dictatorship, over 40,000 people were either killed, tortured, or disappeared. It may be easy to put these numbers beside those of tyrants such as Stalin and Hitler and downplay their severity. Perhaps you could even convince yourself that their suffering was a necessary sacrifice for some sort of greater good, or that maybe those people just deserved it. But behind every single number, there was a name and a face and a story.